Hello and welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. From Ukraine to the Middle East, from regime change debates to the rise of non-state power centres, the global order is under unprecedented strain. As states struggle to maintain control, strongmen, markets, technology and militias are redefining power. The question now is whether stability can be restored or whether volatility is the new world order. Now, joining us today to discuss this is Scott Lucas, a professor at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. He is a journalist, political analyst and leading commentator on global conflicts, great power politics and Middle East affairs. Thank you very much for joining us, Scott. It's a pleasure to have you on the programme to discuss what's going on in the world.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Pleasure. Let's get straight into this. In a world where Putin, Xi, Erdogan and others can flex power, along with the likes of Elon Musk and global markets can topple governments, who is actually shaping the new global architecture today? The state, strongman leaders, or non-state forces like tech, militias, and markets, for example?
All of the above. I mean, that may not be a helpful answer to get us further into detail at this point, but the fact here is that whether we talk about now or whether we talk about historically, that power is wielded in different arenas, economic, military, and political, by these different groups. Certainly, it was the case, for much of my career as an academic, and indeed even growing up in the United States and then working in the UK, that you would look at the power of corporations, big multinational, transnational corporations, and that we could even be talking by the 1990s of this movement of globalization in which the corporations played such a key part. Certainly it's the case that non-state actors have a part to play, that activists have a part to play. We're not just simply there at the whim of presidents and prime ministers and militaries, but I think a lot of the power has always come from states. It's come from states, whether they happen to be democratic, whether they happen to be authoritarian, whether they respect international rights, whether they try to break those international rights. I think my approach to this question for this discussion is the big difference now is that while each of these groups wields power, I think we're at a point in 2026 where the post-1945 international system, you might call it the international system of order, is breaking down. It was always an imperfect system. We know that states abused this system. States abused the United Nations. They abused regional organizations. They flouted whatever we consider to be international law. But still, there was a general acceptance that you had rules of the game that you observed. I think we have a combination of different governments we could point to, or different systems, who are simply not only saying, we'll try to get away with this operation or with that operation, but who are effectively saying the international rules of the game do not apply to us. I think that was the case with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I think it is possibly the case with China if they decide to make moves on Taiwan, if they try to go beyond an alternative economic system to challenging the international system we've had for 80 years. I think it is definitely the case with the Trump administration, especially Trump and some of his advisors, who actually believe we don't believe in alliances anymore. We don't believe in the European Union. We think that should be broken up. We don't even really believe in NATO. We certainly don't believe in the UN. We only believe in our own power for our own personal profit. And that, I think, makes it a very dangerous situation for whether I'm in Ireland or whether you're in India, trying to assess how we get some type of stability and security.
Indeed. And Scott, let's shift and focus in on Europe next. Of course, the war in the east of the continent will be reaching its 4th year in February. Has the Ukraine war now become less about territory and more about the credibility of Western deterrence? And if so, who's really winning that war?
I mean, it's about both, and we'll see this in the next few weeks as we get what I think will be confirmation of proposals from Ukraine and Europe with support from the US to try to end this Russian invasion, and then the Kremlin's rejection of those proposals. I think we need to be honest here because there's a lot of spin, misinformation, disinformation. We need to be honest here that the intent of the full-scale invasion in 2022, which really built upon Russian attempts to break up Ukraine since 2014, the intent in 2022 was to dominate the entire country. It actually was to capture or kill the ministers of the Zelensky government. It was to install, certainly, if not a puppet government, one that would accept Moscow's demands. It was about seizing a large chunk of Ukraine and making it part of Greater Russia. And although Putin has failed in some of those aims, he has failed to capture Kyiv, for example, he still wants to take more Ukrainian territory. And in particular, he wants to seize the rest of this strategic Donetsk region in the east of the country. And don't take it from me, take it from him. He said it repeated last week that Russia will have the Donetsk region, whether by negotiation or by force. I think it is also from Russia's point of view, to take those areas which it is occupying, whether it's in the east, the south of Ukraine, or Crimea, and even if they're not legally recognized as Russian, to try to make them Russian in all but name, to completely change the societies there, to change the systems there. I think for the rest of Ukraine, unoccupied Ukraine, free Ukraine, it's about maintaining the territory that they currently control, not giving up more territory. But I think beyond that, it's also strengthening itself, which might sound bizarre after they have taken such a heavy cost resisting the Russian invasion. But I think you have Ukraine as part of Europe, as part of the international community, and using financial and military support from that international community to try to say, even if we have to give up part of our territory, not legally, but we have to accept it's occupied for some time to come, we will be stronger. We will have an economy which will be reconstructed. We will have, in particular, a military industry which has got a big advantage in technology now. We will become part of the European Union, and we will have security guarantees, which means that even though we're not a member of NATO, it effectively means that we have the same guarantees that a NATO member in Eastern Europe would have.
We'll certainly see how that plays out. And of course, Scott, the world is reeling now from the outcomes of the newly branded Don Roe doctrine, of course, with the United States capturing Nicolas Maduro and striking Venezuela. We saw him getting escorted to his first day of court today. In regards to this, is regime change ever legitimate if it's enforced militarily, even when the target is an authoritarian leader accused of criminality?
Well, let me say, first of all, because it goes back to your first question, that this kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and then putting Maduro through the trial and his wife through the trial in New York, is part of this shattering of international law and effectively this fracturing of the international system. There's absolutely no legal basis to kidnap the head of a sovereign nation. The only basis on which you could really do that would be if there was an imminent threat from that country to yours. So if Venezuela was on the point of attacking the United States militarily, possibly you could argue with a cyber attack, something like that. But short of that, no, there's no justification, especially when the evidence against Maduro that we have seen publicly, because the indictment was lodged in 2020, is so weak. Your immediate question, I think, is the pertinent one, and which is, all right, having violated international law, is there any justification for the United States to go in and to get rid of a president who was repressive, who intimidated, detained, sometimes killed his opponents, who ran his country's economy into the ground, who has been responsible in part for more than 10% of the population fleeing the country? More than 3 million people have left Venezuela in recent years. And I think If I was going to go, we had longer time for this. I could give you the justifications we could talk about in terms of the one justification the U.S. could claim would be a responsibility to protect. And the responsibility to protect, which goes back to the late 90s, is that if a government is on the verge of carrying out a heinous, effectively what we call crimes against humanity against its own people, then there might be a justification for intervening.
Yes.
But we know that in 2003, when the false pretext was given that you had to get rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq because he had the weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, that regime change actually led to more destruction, more deaths, more violence. It is not just a case of whether you might have a reason for regime change, but whether it actually will provide stability and security. Having said all that, let me give you a line, a value-added line to take further. The U.S. is no longer pursuing regime change in Venezuela. After Donald Trump's press conference on Saturday, when he said, "Oh, we will run Venezuela," and we might have to have boots on the ground, his administration scrambled to pull back from that because that actually contradicts his campaign promise not to have U.S. troops involved in foreign interventions. They are now talking about regime containment or regime coercion. And what that means is, although Nicolas Maduro is gone, his government remains. The vice president has become acting president, Delcy Rodriguez. The defense minister, General Pedrino, is still there. The interior minister is still there. The foreign minister is still there. And as Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, made clear over the weekend, he is in talks with Rodriguez. What will happen is that government will be expected to accept U.S. demands on the oil industry, broader U.S. demands on the economy, and demands for Venezuela to separate itself from Cuba, Russia, Iran, and China. So this is a more complicated question we have up now. Will this tactic by the Trump administration of regime coercion bend Venezuela to its will?
We'll see what happens, certainly. Scott, let's turn to the Middle East next. Israel last year bombed 6 countries, including Palestine, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Qatar, and 3 additional jurisdictions, including Tunisia, Malta, and Greece. How far can Israel push militarily before it risks triggering a broader regional war? And does Washington still have real leverage over Israeli decision-making, or has that era ended?
Now, how far will Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu test that question of turning regional instability into complete regional disorder and effectively war? And the question is, the answer is we don't know, especially with Netanyahu still being under pressure of the possibility of elections in Israel and the fact that he still faces a trial on bribery charges. What I will tell you is this: we don't even have to say how far he has gone. Let's talk about what has already happened. On the basis, after Hamas's own mass killing in Israel on October 7th, 2023, which we cannot forget, because around 1,200 people were killed that day, many of them civilians. Israel, which has had wars throughout its history, ever since it was created in 1948, it's had wars with other states. But this was one of the deadliest, in which Israel killed almost 70,000 people in Gaza. It displaced 90% of the population. It kept many of those 2.2 million people on the point of starvation, on the point of lacking shelter, lacking water, lacking health care. This was a possible, in the words of the International Criminal Court, crime against humanity, which is why Benjamin Netanyahu faces an arrest warrant to this day, as does, by the way, the deceased leader of Hamas, technically, Yahya Sinwar. Israel, in connection with that also, as you mentioned, has carried out the operations to kill the leaders of other movements, the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, leaders in Iran's political and military establishment, including the attempt during the 12-day war in June 2025 to kill the president and the supreme leader. It has tried to occupy and take more land in Syria, carrying out bombings near Damascus. there are no rules of the game that Israel recognizes in terms of international standards. This is not, by the way, say it's angels versus devils. I could also tell you about violations by Hamas. I could tell you about the fact that I'm a fierce opponent of Iran's regime, which represses its people. But no, I think we have to be honest here and say, look, Israel is going to carry out with impunity the political and military operations that it seeks. Now, can the Trump administration limit that? Has the Trump administration limited it? Yes and no. The Trump administration has helped enable much of the Israeli action. It helped, like the Biden administration did, it helped enable Israel in its mass killing in Gaza. It helped enable Israel in its 12-day war on Iran, even joining that war to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. It has endorsed Israel's attacks inside Lebanon. But at the same time, when those Israeli operations possibly looked to go too far, or when there were other motives, then, for example, Donald Trump sent his envoys out there to get a fragile ceasefire in Gaza, in large part because he wants the Nobel Peace Prize, and in large part because he wants to get economic profits out of Gaza. And he called for a halt to the Israeli war in Iran when he thought it was going to go too far and be too destabilizing. But what I would say to you is that even if Trump intervened at that point to try to pull back the Israelis a bit, the future of Gaza is one of Israeli occupation and of outside countries exploiting Gaza's resources and exploiting the possibility they can make profits from it. In other words, Gaza, although it has a fragile ceasefire, Israel will probably be in occupation of 53% of the Gaza Strip for the foreseeable future.
Scott, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but let's end this conversation on either a high or a low note. Of course, 2025 has been entwined in global conflicts throughout continents. However, as we enter a new year, 2026, what does a realistic path back to stability look like, or what do we need? Or do we need to accept that volatility is the new normal?
You know, a lot of what we talked about is dark and it's depressing, and it's the inhumanity of people. But fundamentally, we start, I think, in answer to your question, with ourselves, that we can be humane, we can be caring, we can be decent. This has to start from the grassroots. People in their various communities have to try to find dialogue and find cooperation rather than division and confrontation and making this an us versus them question. That's not going to immediately stop a Vladimir Putin. It's not going to immediately stop a Xi Jinping if he wants to take Taiwan. It's not going to stop a Donald Trump. It's not going to stop other authoritarians. But if you start with that, you can influence your communities and your nations where you stake out the lines of what should be proper behavior. In other words, getting back to the rules of the game. I'm speaking to you, you're in India, one of the largest countries in the world, yet one that a lot of people don't talk about if they are in Western Europe or in the United States. And the fact here is that India, for example, has a space, both in terms of the way it develops its own society, a multicultural society, a multi-religious society, which faces a lot of challenges. Can you proceed with decency and tolerance for all? India has tense relations with certain countries. Let's say this, Pakistan. Can you find a way to coexist with Pakistan and avoid the confrontation that you've had recently? And the same would be true of Pakistani communities, by the way. I could do that for each country in the world. And the reason why I put it that way is quite often if we look at the big conflicts and say, no, we can't do anything about this, this is just terrible, and we get frustrated, we get resigned, we check out, or we fall into the traps on social media. If we realize that the hope lies in our communities and actually finding a way forward together, then you have a glimmer of light from too much of the darkness that we see on a day-to-day basis.
Professor Scott Lucas, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your insight here on Focal Length. And with that, it's a wrap on this episode. For more international news and updates, stay tuned on NewsX World.